In this video, we'll explain the reason why Gabriel came to see Daniel. Reminder to hit the subscribe button below and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date as new videos come out. And if you're interested in supporting this ministry, just go to justscripture.org and click on the support page. So far in our chapter 9 study, we've seen how Daniel recalled and reread Jeremiah's 70 years prophecy that prompted him to intense prayer for forgiveness and restoration for the entire nation of Israel to go back into the promised land. During which, Gabriel shows up to give Daniel more insight on God's plans for his chosen people. In this video, we will examine Gabriel's arrival in verses 20 through 23. But when we get to verses 24 through 27, the two most important pieces of prophecy for us are the mentioning of the city and sanctuary being destroyed, and prior to that there will be a Mashiach being cut off. So here's the straightforward of all this. If the destruction is about the 70 AD Roman conquest of Jerusalem, then this is the ultimate death blow to the critical position, because there is absolutely no way for them to argue that for a later interpolation of this verse into Daniel 9, like they try to do with Isaiah 45 of the naming of Cyrus. And on the Jewish side of things, if the Mashiach that is cut off can be demonstrated to be talking about the promised Messiah, the Messianic King, the Son of David, the Son of God, the Son of Man, is going to die by means of execution, then, well, let's face it, the list of available candidates is down to one. Now, the whole scope to the 70 weeks prophecy is laid out in the following. In verse 24, we are told the total length of time and the end result of the prophecy. In verse 25, it talks about how the prophecy will be initiated and about 77 and 62 weeks worth of events that are to take place. In verse 26, it says after 62 weeks that the Mashiach will be cut off and the city and sanctuary will be destroyed. Then in the final verse, the final 70th week of the prophecy is laid out. But what I want to stress here to any Christian that's listening in is that verse 26 is the most important one for us, not verse 27. Verse 27 is extremely important in the discussion of eschatology, but verse 26 is where divine inspiration can be shown, which can lead us to presenting the gospel with a non-believer. So, at the end of the day, if you and I differ about the 70th week, that's really a secondary issue that does not affect one's salvation. So, be mature and agree to disagree. But I promise you that everyone that is watching in, both non-believers and believers, that I will cover these 4 verses intensely. I will address and discuss all of the views. And I will critique and challenge even the varying Christian views that are out there. This will not be me showing you one view and then declaring myself to be right. So, giving a so-called coherent presentation that you might see on many other videos. So, regardless of your current viewpoint, all that I ask is that you come at this study with a fresh perspective and desire to know the truth rather than being right. And I hope that you understand the difference between those two. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Verses 20 through 27. And while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Yahweh my God for the holy mountain of my God. Yes, while I was speaking in prayer, even the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I have come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter, and consider the vision. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem, unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. Even he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, then that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Now in those 8 verses, there's an interpretation point to be made that we should all be agreeing on, and that is that it is spoken in straightforward prose language, meaning that there is no poetic structure to them. It didn't sound any different than the earlier 19 verses. The simple reading of those verses has A happening, then B, then C, then D, all the way to the end of verse 27. Now, just in case you are wondering if I will be only using the KJV throughout this study, I will not. I know very well the translation differences that surround the 4 prophetic verses, especially in verse 25. And all of those will be brought out in full display as we move forward. But if you are wondering, well, could we simply, appeal to the Dead Sea Scrolls for some help on the matter? Well, we currently can't. Because out of those 8 scrolls that contain portions of Daniel, only one of them contains any part of chapter 9. The 3rd and 8th scroll covers an overlapping range, but when you look at the specific contents of those 2 scrolls, is that you have portions from chapters 8 and 10, but nothing of 9 was preserved over the 2,000 years. But if you want to know how much of each chapter has been currently found from the Qumran caves, then we can look at all 8 scrolls and see what verses are covered from each compared to their total number of verses and get the following. Chapter 1 has 57% found, Chapter 2, 78%, Chapter 3, 57%, Chapter 4, 35%, Chapter 5, 52%, Chapter 6, 64%, Chapter 7, 75%, Chapter 8, 59%, Chapter 9, 22%, Chapter 10, 81%, Chapter 11, 40%, and Chapter 12 has 0% found, as nothing has been found out of those 13 verses yet. So altogether, 49% of the book of Daniel has been recovered since 1948. I would say that's pretty amazing for 8 scrolls being over 2,000 years old each. The exciting thing is that number can only go up. So who knows, maybe they'll find another stockpile and the rest will be recovered. But the most important thing that the Dead Sea Scrolls showed us was that there was no Christian tampering of the Old Testament by retroactively inserting prophecies in to make it look like Jesus was the Messiah. And because of that, critics then have to try to date the Gospels and Acts much later so that there would be enough time to massage the stories around to make it look like Jesus fulfilled those hundreds and hundreds of Old Testament prophecies. And don't forget that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, so we can't have that coming before, 70 AD. So it's got to come after because supernatural predictive prophecy is not possible. So in many ways, we would need the DeLorean to convince some people that the biblical events actually happened. Let's now cover verses 20 through 23 of Gabriel's arrival. In verses 20 through 21, Daniel said that while he was speaking, praying, confessing, and presenting, that Gabriel suddenly showed up. But catch that Daniel said he was confessing his sin and the sin of his people, Israel. This confirms our earlier interpretation that Daniel was praying on behalf of all Israel by appealing to the repentance clause found at the end of Leviticus 26. Daniel was taking on the mediator role no different than the high priest did annually during Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. At the end of verse 20, Daniel said that his supplication was for the holy mountain of his God. We know that God's holy mountain is his city Jerusalem, where he chose to dwell inside of the temple. In verse 16, Jerusalem fell right in the middle of both of those phrases. So, we know that the holy mountain of God is Jerusalem. In verse 21, Daniel said, "The man Gabriel came to him." Daniel described Gabriel as a man in chapter 8's vision of the ram and goat. And currently, it's been 13 years since Gabriel interpreted that vision, which Daniel referenced in the middle of verse 21. The next thing that Daniel mentioned was that Gabriel showed up about the time of the evening oblation. This is talking about the daily afternoon offering or animal sacrifice that was conducted at the temple. Exodus 29:38 through 41 says that 2 lambs are to be offered upon the altar daily. Verse 39 says that one of them is to be offered in the morning and the other in the evening. In verse 41, we see that the evening offering is the same thing as the evening oblation that is offered up to Yahweh. So Daniel is trying his best to keep the law as much as possible, even though there is no temple altar that he can offer a yearling on. Now, a couple of passing notes about lamb offerings. First, it is done as a sin offering. That's important because not all offerings in the Mosaic Law were connected with sin. Exodus 12 is probably the most famous and well-known of the Old Testament examples because this is when Passover was instituted by God, requiring a yearling without blemish for each household. What you might not know is that lamb offerings were also required at the Festival of First Fruits and the Festival of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. But a lamb offering wasn't involved with any of the 3 fall feasts. Just a little tidbit to think about. The first mentioning of a lamb offering in the Bible is near the beginning with the story of Cain and Abel. Anybody familiar with the story likely has had some confusion over the years as why it says that God did not regard Cain's offering, but he did with Abel's. Needless to say, it has nothing to do with farming versus shepherding. What it deals with is what exactly they each offered up. What they brought to the table tells us a lot about their current heart condition. Abel brought a sin offering with the lamb, while Cain offered a grain offering from the produce of this field. A grain offering was basically a free will offering to the Lord in a similar fashion to someone in church putting some money in the collection plate. It doesn't save you, it's just there to help church function in its worship. While the sin offering was done in recognition that we need God's forgiveness in order to be saved, in a similar sense in taking part in the communion meal. So, the difference between these two is that Abel recognized his sins needed to be atoned for, while Cain did not. So, when Cain got mad over the situation, God said the following to him. Then Yahweh said to Cain, "Why are you furious? And why do you look despondent?" It's interesting how God usually starts a lot of conversations with questions as if he doesn't already know the answer to them. God continues saying, "If you do what is right, won't you be accepted?" So God is telling Cain, if your works are always 100% good, then you should be fine, right? There's no sin that you need to worry about if you act perfect all the time. God goes on, "But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." it's this last line that has buffaloed many over the years. Because it sounds like God is telling Cain that he must master his own sin by his own work and doing, which is 100% contrary to the rest of the Bible and what it teaches. The last line is made up of only 2 Hebrew words that mean desire and rule. So there's a lot of filler that translators have to do here to make this verse sound coherent. But the confusion can be resolved if one goes back to the prior line for clarification. This line on its own makes no sense when broken down. God said, if you don't do what is right, meaning that, the person has already committed sin, but then in the next part of the line, it makes it sound as if sin itself is sitting outside the doorway ready to overtake Cain. But Cain has already sinned. And God knows that, and Cain knows that as well. So sin is not outside crouching at the door, it's already inside Cain's heart. Note that God here is trying to get Cain to acknowledge his sin by asking him these questions. So the line saying that sin is crouching at the door, the Hebrew word here for sin can also be translated as sin offering in many other places like it's done, including Leviticus 4, 11 times. That's all about sin offerings that are to be made. And crouching really means lying down, like all 4 legs of an animal on the ground. So this line could, and probably should be read as a sin offering is lying at the door. And when you put this all together, God is telling Cain, if you have sinned, a sin offering is lying at the door for you to make an atonement. So, paraphrasing, if you want to get right with me, go get one of the sheep lying outside beside the gate, confess your guilt, offer up the lamb, and I will forgive you just like I did with your brother. Now, all this Old Testament lamb sin offering business was ultimately done to foreshadow the work of Christ on the cross as our spotless lamb taking away the sins of the world. Paul flat out said that Jesus is our Passover lamb in 1 Corinthians 5:7. And since all the Gospels record Jesus dying at 3 in the afternoon, is that we know that he was sacrificed at the time of the evening oblation, the same time in which Gabriel shows up to give Daniel prophetic insight that includes a Messiah that will be cut off. What I hope you get from all that is that none of this is merely coincidental. This goes far beyond the mind of what any human can possibly dream up just for a good piece of fiction. In verse 22, Gabriel said that he came to give Daniel skill and understanding. Many translations will read insight and understanding, while in the complete Jewish Bible it says to enable you to understand this vision clearly. The 2 Hebrew words are sahel and banah. Sahel was translated earlier in Daniel 1 as skillful in all wisdom and learning when Daniel entered Nebuchadnezzar's court education program as a teen. In verse 13, Daniel prayed for Israel to understand thy truth. So this is Daniel's prayer request being answered. The other places in Daniel say understand as well as wise, referring to some people in regards to understanding Daniel's prophecies. Banah is used 4 times in Daniel. In chapter 8, it was translated as meaning, since Daniel was confused and needed some help making sense out of the symbolic vision of the ram and goat. Putting these together, you have Gabriel telling Daniel, here's God's inside plan for his people, Israel and Jerusalem, in straightforward language. Some will say that Daniel was confused about Jeremiah's 70 years prophecy, but we put that to rest in part 1 of our chapter 9 study, because there we saw Daniel would have heard Jeremiah's prophecy in 605 in Jerusalem before he was taken to Babylon. Then, after the second Babylonian siege, he would have read Jeremiah's letter which is found in chapter 29, in Nebuchadnezzar's court that contained additional info about the 70 years that flat out said Israel will be returned back at the end of the 70 years. So Daniel knows how to count to 70 and that the exile is nearing its 70th year. Gabriel's arrival is about him sharing with Daniel another layer in God's plan. Daniel didn't forget about the 4 empires in God's everlasting kingdom that destroys the 4th in its little horn. He knows that the first empire with the Babylonians has been checked off. And he is presently living in the Second Empire era. He's not stupid. He knows that the Greeks will come next from the vision of the goat and ram taking down, or that is, the goat taking down the ram, and that a 4th kingdom will come after them before God's kingdom is ushered in. Gabriel is giving Daniel specifics as to what will happen throughout the times of the Gentiles. In verse 23, Gabriel said, "At the beginning of thy supplications, that he took off to come meet Daniel." This line made Montgomery believe that his make-believe author constructed the prayer as a filler. Commenting on verse 23, Jimmy doubled down on this, saying, "The repetition of verse 21 and verse 22 can be due to the need of resuming the line of discourse after the long parentheses, that is the gap in time, in verse 21. According to verse 23, the angel came forth at the beginning of the prayer, as it takes time for even an angel to fly fast to earth. So the prayer was dramatically introduced to fill up the interim." Let's look at what Monty is talking about here. He's saying that in verses 21 and 23 state that Gabriel took off right when Daniel started praying. And by the time he was done around the evening oblation at 3 o'clock, Gabriel had finally made it to him. Well, here's the thing. The Hebrew Ya'af is translated as faint or weary, like being fatigued, in the other 8 verses it shows up in the Old Testament. Most notably in Isaiah 40:31 that says, "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint." So the word is best understood as someone being really fatigued, not someone flying around the sky like Superman. So, between Daniel and Gabriel, the one who is so tired and weary that he is about ready to faint is Daniel, because he's been fasting, wearing heavy sackcloth, and lying in burnt ashes. Plus, it's Babylon in the middle of the afternoon, so it's probably like, 100 degrees out there in the scorching sun. And that is why Daniel said Gabriel touched him to give him strength, just like he did 13 years before at the river Ulai in chapter 8. But what about the word swiftly? Well, the word Ya'af occurs only here in the entire Old Testament, and Strong's defines it as weariness, fatigue, and faintness, with its etymology coming from Ya'af, the prior word in the verse. So you're almost hearing the same Hebrew word back to back here, but both are about being fatigued. This construction is like in chapter 7 with time, times, and half a time, where the back-to-back usage created a doubling effect on the second times for 2 years. Or we could look at, Numbers 14:7, where the word ma'od comes back to back to heighten the explanation of how good the promised land was when Joshua and Caleb scouted it out. So both words apply to Daniel and describes his extreme fatigue from the fasting and praying in the heat. This whole scene is no different than Jesus' condition after he fasted for 40 days in the wilderness and was tempted by Satan. After which he told Satan to get lost, but in Matthew 4:11 it goes on saying, "Then the devil left him, And behold, angels came and ministered unto him. It's another way that Daniel serves as a type by prefiguring Christ in the Old Testament. Now, just in case you think I made verse 21 sound the way I wanted to, well, if you were to read it in the NASB, it says that Gabriel came to me in my extreme weariness. There's no mention of Gabriel coming by means of aerial flight. And you will see a similar type of rendering in the Christian Standard Bible, the Holman, and the Net Bible translations as well. So, once again, when we simply examine the text, we see that the critical view falls apart each and every time. Reminder to hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.